"Sir, she put something in your juice," said the little black boy to the millionaire. Edward Voss was not a man who feared many things. At 52, he had built an empire from nothing: real estate, tech patents, political lobbying. His name was whispered in boardrooms and printed in financial magazines. His silver hair was always perfectly styled, his navy suits tailored like armor. He was known for being sharp, calculated, untouchable. That morning, he sat alone at an upscale cafe tucked into the corner of an urban plaza. The air was crisp, the kind of early breeze that smelled like old money and fresh citrus. A tall glass of orange juice gleamed in front of him, catching the morning light. A deal worth $80 million was awaiting his final signature. Everything was under control, until a small voice cracked through the silence. "Sir, don't drink that." Edward blinked and looked up. A little black boy, no older than 6, stood beside his table. His shirt was faded and stained, his knees dusty. His small hands were pressed together, pleading. His eyes were wide, not with hunger, but something else entirely: fear. Edward glanced around, confused. "Excuse me." The boy took a shaky breath and stepped closer. "Please, she put something in your juice." Edward stared at the child, unsure whether to laugh, panic, or call security. Was this a joke? Some scam? He looked toward the cafe. The waitress, a young woman in a dark coat, red nails, was already walking briskly back toward the kitchen. "You mean her?" he asked. The boy nodded frantically. "She poured something from a bottle. She looked around first. I saw her do it." Edward's throat tightened. His instinct was to brush it off, but then his eyes moved to the glass again. He hadn't taken a sip yet. The juice, which moments ago had looked so bright and refreshing, now looked off, slightly too thick. Tiny bubbles gathered near the rim. He didn't lift it. Instead, he stood, fast, firm. The boy flinched. "It's okay," Edward said, his voice softer. "You did the right thing." He reached into his coat, pulled out his phone, and called his assistant. "Tell building security to lock down the cafe. Now." Within minutes, the scene exploded. Security. Guards appeared at the doors. Customers were confused. The woman who served the drink was already gone. Surveillance footage showed her slipping out the rear exit 2 minutes before the alert went out. Edward's untouched glass was taken to a lab. The boy was escorted into a quiet office along with Edward and 2 guards. "What's your name, kid?" Edward asked. The boy hesitated. "Zion." "Where are your parents?" "My mama's working. She cleans upstairs sometimes. She let me sit in the corner while she mopped the hallway. I saw the lady from the kitchen come out and pour something into your juice. She looked scared. Then she smiled, real fake, when she came out." Edward sat back, heart still pounding. The deal was forgotten, the juice untouched. He studied the child, his clenched fists, his dirty fingernails, the fear still lingering in his eyes. "You could have said nothing," Edward said. "Why tell me?" Zion looked down. "'Cause my mama says to always speak the truth, even if it scares you." The test results came back 3 hours later. Confirmed. Traces of antifreeze mixed with a sweetener compound. A slow-acting, clear, odorless poison. 1 sip wouldn't have killed him instantly, but within an hour or 2, his kidneys would have begun shutting down. He might have collapsed on his flight out of town, or alone in his car, or hours later, too late to trace it back to a single glass of juice. Edward Voss, billionaire and self-proclaimed man in control, had come within inches of dying without even realizing it, and he would have, if not for Zion. The woman, the unidentified waitress, was a temp hired only that week. No social media, fake ID. By the time authorities reached the address she'd listed, the apartment was empty. Whoever she was, she'd planned it well. Too well. Edward's world was built on controlling chaos. But that day, chaos had knocked on his table, and a little boy from the shadows had stopped it. That evening, Edward cancelled all meetings. He returned to the cafe after it closed and asked to see the cleaning crew. Zion was there, holding his mother's hand. She looked exhausted, wearing a janitor's jumpsuit. Her face was lined with quiet strength. When Edward approached, she immediately pulled Zion close. "Sir, I'm sorry if he bothered you. He saved my life," Edward interrupted. His voice cracked for the first time in years. "He didn't bother me. He gave me back everything." Cameras showed up days later when the story hit the news. Billionaire saved by homeless child's warning. Edward never corrected the headline. He didn't tell them Zion wasn't homeless, just forgotten by a system too busy to care. Because in his eyes, forgotten children were often the truest heroes. 3 days later, Edward Voss sat in his office, staring at the skyline. He had survived assassination attempts in boardrooms, political ambushes, even cyber attacks. Yet the closest he ever came to death was in broad daylight, with a glass of juice, in the most casual moment of his life. And it was a 6-year-old boy in a torn beige shirt who stopped it. Zion. Edward couldn't get his face out of his mind. The fear, the trembling hands, the fact that he could have walked away and said nothing. But didn't. "Because my mama says to always speak the truth." Those words echoed louder than the stock ticker on his wall. By the following week, Edward had done what he did best: investigate. He learned that Zion's mother, Sarah Amani, worked part-time in multiple buildings, including the one Edward owned. She cleaned bathrooms at night, boardrooms before sunrise. Their last permanent address had been a shelter. Now they stayed in a cramped room with another family. Sarah had no record, no complaints, no favors asked. She'd raised Zion with almost nothing, and yet had somehow given him everything that mattered. Edward did something uncharacteristic. He didn't send a lawyer. He showed up in person. They met at a modest neighborhood cafe. Zion clutched a red plastic toy and leaned into his mother as Edward arrived. Sarah stood up quickly. "Mr. Voss, we're sorry again." "I never expected—" "You don't have to apologize," Edward said, sitting across from them. "I owe you my life. And your son." He looked at Zion, who blinked up shyly. "You saved me." Zion offered a timid smile. "I want to do something for—" "You," Edward continued, "but not charity. I want to invest." Sarah hesitated. "In what?" "In your future," Edward said. "In his." That week, Edward arranged housing for Sarah and Zion. No cameras, no press. A safe, clean apartment near a good school. He set up a trust fund for Zion's education, options Edward himself never had as a child. But he didn't stop there. He launched a foundation, the Truth First Initiative, in Zion's name. Its mission: to support children in underserved communities who show courage, honesty, or ethical action, especially where speaking out is hard or dangerous. The poisoning investigation remained open. Authorities suspected the woman had been hired after Edward voted against a corrupt zoning deal tied to organized crime. A silent hit, no trace, no link. But what they hadn't counted on was the one person no one noticed: a barefoot little boy waiting quietly near a service door. 1 year later, Zion stood beside Edward at a private dinner, not to be paraded but to speak. He wore a simple white button-up and looked nervous. Edward leaned down. "Just be yourself." Zion nodded. Then into the mic. "I didn't do nothing special. I just saw something wrong and I said it. My mama told me the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always right." Silence. Then a standing ovation. Zion didn't bask in it. He looked up at Edward and whispered, "Can we go home now?" Edward smiled. "Of course." In the months that followed, Edward changed. He took fewer meetings, visited schools, walked without bodyguards. For a man who once thought he had everything, it took nearly dying to see what he'd been missing: connection, purpose, legacy. Zion's story never faded, not because of Edward's fame, but because of what it reminded the world. That the smallest voice can interrupt the darkest intentions, that a glass of juice can hold death, and a child's truth can hold life. In the end, it wasn't wealth or power that saved Edward Voss. It was the courage of a little black boy who simply chose to speak up. If you enjoyed this story, give it a thumbs up and hit subscribe for more emotional, dramatic, and unexpected tales. And let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and keep watching.